Venomous back with more classic StarCraft 2 because newer is not always better. And we have my favorite player of all time playing today in the top right of Xel'Naga Caverns, and he's IdrA, IdrA Fields, the American macro Zerg. Some people call him the Graken, some people call him the Macro Machine, some people call him Gregors. No matter what you call him, this was a guy who had probably the most significant impact on the foreigner scene in the early days of StarCraft 2. He had the biggest stream, he had the best tournament results, and he was the player who stayed in Korea the longest, back in Brood War, when it really meant something to stay in Korea, because it meant that you were staying in these top-tier Korean pro-gaming houses, full of people who didn't speak your language, absorbed in culture shock, and being a part of something that wasn't like anything that was going on in the States. It was incredibly jarring, it was difficult, and it was as good as it got in terms of practice, regardless of what race you played. So today we have a game from IEM Hanover, which was a tournament that took place in 2011. Now in terms of StarCraft, this isn't actually that popular of a tournament. There are some StarCraft tournaments like MLG Orlando 2011 that a lot of people will look back at and sort of remember fondly. Oh yeah, that's that tournament where Huck won. This isn't really one of those tournaments. IEM Hanover is actually remembered more for its League of Legends, and I know a lot of people watching this channel are very tempted they're very tempted to click away from this video at the mere mention of League of Legends. But to wrap up that point quickly, basically what I'll say is that this Russian team in League of Legends called Moscow 5 had a very solid performance at this tournament, and they had a famous match with CLG, a very famous North American team featuring Saint Vicious and Hotshot GG. And I think because of that, this event sort of gets forgotten in some esports fans' eyes. But it is on Xel'Naga Caverns. Squirtle has opened for a very standard, safe 3-gate expand. Now on Xel'Naga Caverns, it is a very wide open natural base, which means Protoss players have to be very wary of Zerg players going for these Ling heavy openers. But IdrA was never the sort of player to go for early game aggression or coin flip builds. He's called the Macro Machine for a reason, guys, and we can see he's doing just that, breaking down his rocks to his third to try to expand out there. He's getting +1 Carapace, he's getting Overlord speed, his Roach speed just finished, he's getting Hydra range. Meanwhile, after getting an air unit of Void Ray to help get map control, Squirtle is going into Robo Bay, getting +1, and it looks as though he's going to pressure out on the map. Now it's worth noting that back in this time in Wings of Liberty in 2011, there were no Ravagers, they just didn't even exist. So Protoss players would frequently go for these sentry heavy openings, where they would make a lot of sentries in the early game, which would protect them from a lot of different sorts of Zerg aggression, and more importantly, it would allow the sentries to build up energy over the course of the early game and early mid game, and then the Protoss player will be in a position like this, where they have multiple sentries with full energy, lots of firepower, because they can push the Zerg and force field them away and kill a third base, or if they get lucky they can get a big force field on the ramp and do even more damage. And even if they don't do well and the Zerg is ready, frequently the Protoss player will have enough force fields to throw up a big line and retreat. If you look at a map like Xel'Naga Caverns, even though this sort of was considered one of the better maps early on in the game's lifespan for Zerg, this map wasn't actually that big. It didn't have a lot of counterattack paths. The famous one is sort of this jokish little horseshoe that goes above the mineral third base that we see here that IdrA has taken, as opposed to the gold base in the middle. And really what you saw with this little horseshoe is sometimes people would run, it was usually Lings, because Terran and Protoss players weren't going to shift click units all around there. Usually people would just shift click Lings around the corner, and then Protoss and Terran players figured this out after before the game even came out, because this was a map in the beta, and we can see here that Squirtle in the bottom left of the map has walled off that little back door. It's just like a 2-pylon wall. Squirtle is going into Colossus here, and this is what I was talking about with the horseshoe, is you don't really see much harassment as far as flanking from the horseshoe, but what you do see is this, which is people camping ranged units up on the high ground of the horseshoe. And you would see this with Terran drops and a variety of different other things, but the crux of the issue here is that you're never going to be able to kill the hatchery from that high ground. Unless it's like a tank drop, you're really sort of restricted to just worker harassment. So a lot of times what we see is someone will go up there and get like 3 or 4 worker kills from above the cliff, and the Zerg player will pretty easily shut it down. It's not one of those cliffs that's untraversable by ground, like a Lost Temple cliff. You know, it's just sort of a little ridge. Corruptors and Roaches are on the way here for IdrA. He's getting Carapace and +1 air attack. Now frequently what we see here is the Zerg player just delays and delays and delays until they get as much army as possible, and usually like 6 to 10 Corruptors, and it looks like IdrA might just go in. Big force fields going down, as most of IdrA's army can't actually fight, and the Corruptors do try to focus down the Colossi, and both of the Colossus go down, and we see this weird situation where the Protoss player is sort of sitting here fighting. Well, you don't have any splash damage, Squirtle, you just need to run. So Squirtle's going to retreat back a little bit. IdrA has to respect the 1 Colossus that has been reinforced with, as well as potential Sentry Warpins. And IdrA is in a bit of a choke point here, but with Zerg, very oftentimes, they did not want to let their Protoss opponents continue to build up a Colossus count. So in situations like this, they would frequently try to press their advantage with the Roach Hydra Corruptor force, because once the first few Colossus went down, the Protoss player often would be reeling. The Psystorm tech wasn't as frequently sought after or as quickly sought after back in this time. So if you went Colossus, a big part of the game revolved around maintaining the Colossus and going for unit compositions that really supported the Colossus. And there another one goes down, and IdrA is just flooding with Hydraling Roach here. And Squirtle GG's. This is a best of 5, and we're going to forward to the next match. It's going to be on Metalopolis. And they are far away by ground positions, which is just a fancy way of saying cross spawns. And if you're not familiar with this map, for a very long time you could actually spawn in these positions, which is why Squirtle is scouting this way. This is close by ground. And if you're sort of sitting here wondering, like, what the hell is he talking about, close by ground? Okay, look at the mini-map. The person who spawns here, if IdrA were to spawn here, that would be close by air. If he spawns here, that's cross spots, and if he spawns in the position that Squirtle scouted first, it's close by ground. Close by ground is essentially like the map Steps of War. It's insanely small. It completely changes the strategies that you're going to go for and use. It completely dictates the flow of the game, and it's an absolute game changer. So that's why frequently you will see players scout the close by ground position first. Because if it's close by air, okay, it's a pretty normal game. If it's cross positions, it's a completely normal game. But if it's close by ground, holy crap, you really have to alter your strategy. And this was something that we saw change. This was something that was deemed imbalanced. Because you would get in these situations where you would have games like this where it would be a Zerg player versus either a Terran or a Protoss, and if they spawned in on Metalopolis or Lost Temple or a lot of these other 4-player maps, there's a 2 out of 3 chance you're going to get a legitimate game, and a 1 out of 3 chance you're going to get sort of a jokish, fluky game that's not really balanced. And I know sometimes when people hear statements like that, they almost have a knee-jerk, vitriolic reaction because they've watched so many consecutive WCS casts that they don't think there's a such thing as racial imbalance or map imbalance or anything like that. On this channel, I call them like I see them. You know, if you're used to someone screaming and acting like a 150 supply fight to a 50 supply fight is going to be close, and sort of doing this intellectually dishonest style of casting where people at Blizzard watch it and go, that was great, you didn't say anything negative about the game the whole time. You know, I'm not really that kind of caster. If a certain thing was imbalanced or not fair, especially in the past, I'm going to be intellectually honest and comment about it. Close by ground positions was not fair, and it led to silly, fluky games. Another thing that we saw on maps in this era, specifically this map, was there were no neutral depots or rocks at the bottom of the ramp. Now, in latter games, whenever you spawn into a map, there's a little destructible debris at the base of the ramp, as we see a Stargate opener here for the TOS player. The average Joe might sort of ask himself, well, what the hell is that for? Why are there rocks at the bottom of my ramp? It's because right when the game first came out, probably a few months before this time period, because in 2011 it wasn't so much of a clown show. In 2010 we would see games where Protoss players would just send out a scout at 8, find the Zerg, make 2 pylons at the base of the ramp, a cannon behind it, and the Zerg was insanely far behind 100% of the time. And Blizzard came out and made it where Protoss players actually had to make 3 pylons at the bottom of a ramp to wall a Zerg in, but that was even still ludicrously imbalanced. So they decided to put in neutral depots or neutral rocks at the bottom of ramps. Now what's funny is all the pro gamers and community map makers knew that this double pylon block and this ramp block with double bunker versus Zerg was bullshit. And they would intentionally add these neutral depots to the tournament version of maps. Like if I went to play a custom game with friends and typed in Metalopolis or Cloud Kingdom, there would be multiple different versions that came up, like ESC, Cloud Kingdom, WCS Cloud Kingdom, like the official tournament versions, and then just the horseshit normal ladder versions, Cloud Kingdom LE, that didn't have any neutral ramp at all. So what would happen is pro gamers would play this, and by the way, I also want to point out nothing's going on. It's a standard slow macro game. The Protoss player is opening air units because he wants to get map control. The Zerg player is taking a third while he techs into roaches and gets speed. A lot of times, players, especially new players, will watch my cast and be like, oh, you talked about X and Y for several minutes. Yeah, because nothing was happening. And we can see here Squirtle is going to attack the third base because of the fact that he had a pylon up the third, saw it go down, and he'll immediately range out with his air. Now this is really common. We would see this happen all the time. Protoss player opens a Void Ray with Phoenix. The Zerg player has a hard time ranging all the way out to their third. They get their initial couple queens pressured because of the air units. The army comes via ground, and it's all downhill from here, as IdrA's going to lose both of these queens brutally, be caught completely off guard due to a ridiculous lack of map vision. IdrA didn't have the towers there, and now it looks like he's just going to get rolled over, as it looks like he was trying to tech into Hydra, and he sort of got attacked during a power trough where the Hydras weren't out and his roach speed wasn't done. So the macro machine loses that game. It's 1-1, and I definitely see the irony in me talking about nothing happening and then IdrA just randomly dying to a little push out. Okay, but the point still stands, you know. So going back to what I was talking about, and just to wrap up the point, back when the game first came out, Zerg players could be hard-walled in by 2 bunkers or 2 pylons, and this wasn't really an issue for Protoss and for Terran, just because of the way the races work. You know, if you've played the game for more than a week, you're probably aware of the fact that Zerg is a little bit different than the other races. Zerg plays a little differently. And in the beginning of the game's life, this is something that Blizzard struggled tremendously to balance. And by 2011, there were far less absolutely ludicrous things in the game, like the 2 pylon block at the bottom of the ramp. I mean, I know I've been talking about this for a while, but I want you guys can go back and watch another VenomousClassic that I've done, IdrA vs Tester, another Protoss versus Zerg. And in 2 of the games, it's a best of 5, in 2 of the games, Tester just walks to the other side of the map, makes 2 pylons, a cannon at the base of the pylons, and IdrA auto loses. And he goes for pool first in both games. The hard counter to a play like that. And a lot of people really just sort of get defensive if they hear you say something about their race that they don't like. And let's just be honest, guys. This was way back in 2011. The game has changed a lot. Now, because I really like IdrA, and I like a lot of the old school players, I choose to go back and revisit these games and archive and catalog them. I think it's interesting and fun to do. And I feel like a lot of people sit here and watch these games, and if they're Protoss players and hear something like, yeah, being able to wall in Zerg with 2 pylons was a little bit too powerful, they hear that and sort of say, well, this guy's Zerg biased. And that just sort of blows me away, because if you're going to watch a cast, wouldn't you want to watch something where the person's honest? You know, if you spawn close by ground positions, and you're in a situation where the Terran or Protoss player moves out with an army and can hit your front door by the time you can even make a single unit, wouldn't you want that to be brought up? And furthermore, if I were to cast a game from the 2012 era, where Broodlord Infestor reigns supreme, I'm going to talk about that. And I've casted games from that era, and I have talked about it. So it's not a Zerg-specific thing. It's calling them like you see them. And if you play Protoss, and you hear something about Protoss from 2011 that says that Protoss was strong, and your very first reaction is to sort of get defensive, I just don't get people like that. Because part of the VenomousClassic series is taking a look back at past eras of StarCraft 2 as we see the Protoss player virtually go for an identical build. 3 Gateway expand with Stargate. I don't see how you could watch these videos and get offended about that. It would sort of be like saying, well, this particular sports team back in 2011 was better than this other sports team in 2011. And you're sort of sitting there and you have access to all the records and all the statistics and all the VODs, and you're like, no, you're basically being a homer. It would be like, oh, well, that my team, which basically, if you haven't figured this out, this is how people view their race in StarCraft, is it sort of like their team, and they just support it blindly. By the way, I play all 3 races. I play them all. I'm Diamond Plus with all 3 races. But most people don't. Most people play 1 race. By the way, again, nothing at all has happened. IdrA is ranging out to try to take his 3rd. The Protoss player's gone for 3 gate expand and then has taken a Nexus. It's the same stuff. And a lot of times, the newer viewer, I feel like, becomes sort of perplexed or lost when they watch some of my videos and I'm not just describing everything that happens on the screen second by second. On some level, especially if I'm doing a VenomousClassic and I can't observe and go over to a certain base to make a point and pull up certain tabs to make a point, you know, when you don't have access to showing people things, your hands are sort of tied verbally. And thankfully for IdrA, he has made an Overseer, which means he's probably going to do a little bit better of a job scouting than he did last game. Because one thing that we see in these games as a theme is the Protoss player goes for an air opener off of 3 gate expand and then does a big pressure, and it looks as though the Protoss player doesn't actually have a natural. That was actually a fake. So I would expect a big commitment here from Toss, and IdrA has a bunch of Hydras coming, but this attack is hitting very quickly and sharply. All it takes is 1 force field on the ramp and IdrA is completely fucked. There it is. His clap for Protoss. Woo! Yeah! Get him, Squirtle! You force fielded the ramp! And that's why Zerg's bitch. That's why the Ravager was invented right there. That's all it takes. 1 force field on the ramp and you straight auto lose. Now, guys, I get that IdrA's units were a little late, and at this point, the Protoss players are probably about to have an utter meltdown on their keyboard. Just freaking out about how Zerg biased I am. But let's be honest, guys. In Wings of Liberty, Protoss had a lot of bullshit elements. there was 4-second warp in off of any pylon without gateway attached. All it took was for Protoss players to hide one pylon somewhere on the map, and you could get hit in the mouth with a crushing attack, just like that. Frequently in Wings of Liberty, Zerg versus Protoss became this goofy little mini game where Zerg would send good Zergs would send about 5 lings out on the map with a bunch of shift A move commands playing Find the Pylon. And if you didn't find the pylon, sometimes you just lost. And that was a rough little game of Find the Pylon. Now, I will be honest, IdrA was never particularly diligent with the game of Find the Pylon. You'll see some Zergs where it's like they'll have 2 lings cover the whole map. And we saw earlier in that game on Metalopolis where IdrA had 2 lings sort of next to each other. I'm not a huge fan of that play. You know, if you find the pylon or you find the probe, then you divert your other units if necessary. There's really no reason to have them both together. And I think if you're going to criticize IdrA, one thing that he did, this is going to sound so weird to say, as of course we see pool first into fast expand, and then what do you think? 3-gate coming up, 3-gate Stargate. By the way, for the record, have never seen these games. IdrA's my favorite player in the whole world of all time, and guess what? I've never seen these. I don't know if he wins or loses. And to be frank, I don't know what happens in these games. So when I say, oh, 3-gate with Stargate, that's based off of the last games that I've seen, not off of hindsight. That's another interesting comment that I get sometimes. Oh, you watch these games beforehand. Why are you acting like you're predicting everything that happens? You've seen these. And I get that comment on games that I have and haven't seen. Now, obviously, a lot of times, especially with the VenomousClassic, yeah, I've seen the game. I remember it in my head. Oh yeah, I remember that time In Control played Illusion and it was really dope. And I think to myself, like, yeah, I remember watching that live and being so happy when In Control won. And then like I go back and recover the game for VenomousClassic. But I don't remember the details. This one I straight up haven't seen at all, and I'm just waiting for the Stargate to come down, as Warp Gate is about finished and Gateways 2 and 3 are done. Nexus up here, and we don't see a Stargate yet, which is really, really weird, because A, we've seen a Stargate in the last 2 games, and B, Stargate is really good on this map. Scrap Station, this map is known for having an incredibly short air rush distance, to the point where you would see Terran players do like suboptimal sort of weird builds, whether it be, they would like, not okay, I say suboptimal, they would almost force themselves to go for some sort of air-based aggression. 2-port Banshee, fast drop. Terran players hadn't figured out the 2-1-1 build. That wasn't a part of the metagame back at this time. So you would see all sorts of weird stuff to try to capitalize off of the rush distance. Which I think it's worth noting, here we see a fast expand. And instead of searching, instead of building a Stargate, what do we see here from our Protoss player? Hallucinate. Which of course famously would be used by Chris Huck Loranger, or Loranger if you're going to pronounce it like an American, but it's not pronounced like that. Basically, Huck used Hallucinate, which is a spell in the Century that lets you make fake units that now Protoss players get for default, which, again, is sort of funny. Because Hallucinate is insanely good. You get free scouting information. It's not really stoppable. There's never a situation where, like, just tell me, like, what can Zerg make at this point in the game that can stop that from happening? A Phoenix just flying through and seeing everything. You had to have an Evo chamber to make a Spore, and even then it's a big loss, and it's static. They can't fly over it. Blizzard actually got rid of Hallucinate costing money, and oddly, it sort of made Protoss players not use it as much. And that's sort of one of these weird things that happens with StarCraft. And it's not specific to Protoss players, as we see a Robo Bay come down. But people would do this, where it would be like a build. Like, I'm going to open Hallucinate. You know, some people go Twilight, some people open Robo. No. Some people used to straight up open Hallucinate. It was usually a build that you would see in macro openers like this. Very common for Protoss players to make a handful of sentries in the early game. Remember, these units pretty much straight up counter almost all Zerg cheese. And they can fake aggression well, they can do aggression well. This is why the Sentry was so good, and why the Ravager was needed so badly. If we look at every one of these games, the Protoss player is making sentries in the early game and preventing himself from being killed in the early game. Right after that, he's able to push out and do a potent mid-game attack that can just straight up win. What do you think we saw in Game 3 on Lost Temple? The Protoss player went for a safe opener that literally coulda, shoulda, woulda been a straight up expand macro opener, and then he just moved out with his units like he did regardless of whether or not he would have taken a base. And the power of the force field was so significant that he just straight won. If you get a force field on the ramp in Wings of Liberty, you pretty much win. And I know Protoss players might hear that and get sort of angry, but you shouldn't, because the fact of the matter is Protoss in 2018 is way harder than Protoss in 2011. PvZ at this time was not hard. You did not have to have that much talent to beat players that were better than you in this matchup. That's just the fact of the matter. As we can see, the Protoss player is pushing out here with one Colossus, no range, no force field. An absolutely foolish move out is without a Warp Prism, you're just moving out in the middle of a power trough. And I don't want to sound, and I know at this point I am actually starting to sound Zerg biased, but I just want to point out there's no reason to move out there. You're in a power trough. Your thermal lance is 90% done. You have one Colossus. This is the sort of stuff that Protoss players had to do for Zerg to win at certain points. And that's just the fact of the matter. And if Protoss players feel upset because they hear that, just know the truth. Know that in 2018, it is so much harder to play Protoss. In 2018, Protoss isn't really like a bullshit, joke, gimmick race. It's just, and I'm not saying that's what it was in 2011, but 2018, Protoss, skillful to play, a difficult race. In 2011, I remember back before I started playing all three races, back when I was just starting to sort of learn Protoss off-race, there would be so many PvZs where I would think to myself, I am so far, as I was Protoss, I'm so far behind and have no right to win this game. And there were a few little tricks you could do, the 1 DT to every base trick, the Warp Prism force field on the ramp trick. You know, I mean, I could go on and on and on with stuff that now sort of just sounds like, yeah, that's like a common tactic people just use in games. No, in 2011, these were like killing blows. Like if you got your ramp force fielded in 2011, it's almost like spending all day cooking like a meal, like a turkey or like a goulash, something that takes all day to do, and then right when you get ready to serve it, you spill it everywhere, as we can see Rotterdam circa 2011 lagging like chill. And I remember I would play so many of these PvZs where I would get some filthy force fields off, or I would do a 2-base all-in, as we see IdrA trying to shut down the island base with the Muta. And IdrA is in control here. The Protoss player did try to go for an island base strategy, and he's teching into Colossus as the island base has been completely shut down. He's going into 2 Stargate Void Ray, and essentially what he's hoping for here is that IdrA makes a bunch of corruptors, and of course Void Rays counter corruptors to a certain extent, and IdrA just gets laughed out of the game with Void Rays. But IdrA's in this position where he just has a huge economy, and it's going to be like IdrA's almost already maxed, and the Protoss player is in a position where, yes, his army is scary, but he's not going to be able to remax that quick. A lot of the metagame back in this matchup was Protoss would be building this incredibly powerful army throughout the entire game. And with Zerg, it was like most of the fights, it would be just a trade, and the Zerg would feel like, oh, I barely survived, and the Toss would feel like, oh, I need to replenish my money units. And that was sort of the back and forth of this matchup. And of course, another situation that occurred in this matchup pretty frequently was Protoss players threw some force fields up on these insanely choke pointy small maps. Zerg was out of position for just a second. Zerg loses. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. There is a reason that the Ravager was added, and there is a reason that these 6th century openers aren't seen anymore. So lots of corruptors out here for IdrA, and with Void Ray Colossus they will be very useful. Lots of the corruptibility going down, which made Protoss units take 20% extra damage. Some lag occurring here, and IdrA's army completely cut in half. Half of it not able to attack at all, and there's just simply nothing he could do. The closest we saw to a counterplay in this meta was Zerg's going for Roach Burrow, or I guess up into Ultras, but that's like a Hive Tech play. And we can see here, the Protoss player continues to A-move across the map. He is very low on forceful energy. This was another thing that you would commonly see. Zerg just lose a couple crushing engagements, and then Protoss thinks they're gravy, they keep moving up, and they realize they're out of force field energy. And then you see these very weird engagements where Lings get on top of the army, and suddenly Protoss doesn't look so OP anymore. And what looked to be an IdrA loss is suddenly turning into an IdrA win, as IdrA has creep across the whole map. Squirtle has no third, and this is what I'm talking about. IdrA has 4 bases, Squirtle is virtually mined out. He essentially did a big 2-base all-in where he went for Void Ray Colossus and just tried to win off of one big push. Void Ray Colossus was considered very powerful at this time. Fun fact, IdrA and Artosis had a little show that they did together called Imbalanced. Oftentimes when you hear Jeff and Control Robinson make fun of Artosis for starting shows and not finishing them, he's referring to stuff like Imbalanced. And they actually had an episode of Imbalanced talking about this Void Ray Colossus comp, and they actually came to the conclusion that it was in fact imbalanced. TLDR being that Void Rays counter pretty much everything except Hydras, and the Colossus shit on Hydras. Final game, Shakura's Plateau, and this is old Shakuras. Now, a lot of players, especially my new subscribers, might be saying, new Shakuras, old Shakuras? What the hell is Shakuras? So there's this map, again, that was a big part of the game's history, and there was a ton of tournament games played on this map, Shakura's Plateau. And this map fell into a theme of a lot of the maps from 2011, which was that if you spawn cross, it was decent for Zerg, but you could spawn in these weird wonky positions that put you in these abnormal, suboptimal, shitty spots. And this is one of them. The bases here, the main bases, are actually connected through backdoor rocks. And this was something that was actually worse against Terran than it was against Protoss. Because what you would see whenever, let's just say that IdrA was in the same position that he is in now, and the Protoss is in the same position, except instead of being a Protoss, it's a Terran. So what you'll see a Terran do in this spot is exactly what Liquid Jinro did to IdrA, and they're now forever lost because of inadequate voting. 2011 January round of 8 GSL match against each other. Jinro took a fast expansion. He proceeded to go for a powerful 2-base timing in which he used siege tanks to pressure and siege the outside of IdrA's back door. the cramped nature of this backdoor tunnel makes it hard to defend. Now you might be saying to yourself, well, if there's a backdoor, isn't that good for Zerg? Because they can just like make lings and like attack your backdoor. Well, A, that's not IdrA's style. He's a macro player. Whenever IdrA logs in to StarCraft and thinks, how am I going to win? He's asking himself, how am I going to get more bases? How am I going to get more workers? How am I going to prove in a long game that I'm the better player? He's not thinking, oh, okay, we spawned into the gimmicky positions. Now I think I'll go for a risky coin flip that if my opponent scouts or catches onto, results in an auto loss. No, IdrA was always focused on putting himself in a position that he thought would give him the best chance to win, keeping in mind that he thought he was better than his opponents. What does that mean? Because I'm sure some of you just said, like, you idiot, that's what everyone thinks. No, let me explain what I mean. So if I were to go to a tournament tomorrow, me, VenomousClassic, and they were to say, okay, VenomousClassic, your first round group is Serral, Maru, and Innovation. I'm going to cheese every game because I know the players are better than me. They're going to destroy me in a macro game. But if I do a quick cheese, it'll give me the best opportunity to win. Because the further on the game goes, the better off the macro player is. And we can see, despite the fact that an expansion has been taken, IdrA is going for what looks to be a little bit of roach pressure here. Now, pay attention. It looks as though this roach pressure is going to be front door roach pressure. And it looks as though Squirtle's saying, oh crap, those are some early roaches. So it looks initially like IdrA's going to be doing a backdoor push. But no, those rocks have like 2,000 HP each and take forever and a day to get through with Roachling. So if IdrA did a Roachling all in, it'd hit like a minute and a half from now or something ridiculous. So he's just going to go for the front door. Now this was way back in a time where roaches, of course, not only could they not turn into Ravagers, but you could see they're not particularly useful. I mean, they're getting outranged by cannons. The extent of the roach here is to sit at the bottom of the ramp and pretty much just stand out of the way of static defense. And IdrA's going to try to snipe down the sentry here. The Cyber Core is below half health. IdrA has to do everything he can to get the Cyber Core, but a Void Ray is out. Multiple cannons are up on the way. The Protoss player is completely safe, and this rush has been stalled. Now, if this wasn't 2011, the observer might have flicked on the units or the income tab here. Oh, there it is. So they're about even. And I would say they're about even. The Protoss is a little ahead, and what that means for Zerg is that the Protoss is ahead. Because the Zerg always wants to be a base up, he always wants to be a few workers up. And if we look at the infrastructure for Squirtle here, he's not going to die to a frontward assault. He has vision on his back door, and he's teching into Stargate. IdrA is very behind, make no mistake. He's in a position where his lair isn't done. He can't get units that shoot up other than the Queen. Does he have an Evo chamber? Because you need one of those to get a Spore Crawler back in this day. These are the sort of things that people who didn't play the game back then don't realize. The game is, and like, I know a lot of people, if you've actually made it to the end of this, you're probably a Zerg player, because if you're Toss, I've probably pissed you off at least once. But this is just the truth, is Toss was way easier to play back then than it is now. And Zerg had way less options. If you were Zerg, you had to get an Evo chamber before a Spore. This meant if Toss went for Stargate or Dark Templar, and they showed up and you weren't expecting it, and you didn't have an Evo chamber, it's an auto loss. Now if they don't show up, I mean, it's bad, but at least you can build a Spore. A lot of people don't really realize that. They hear these things that I'm saying about Protoss circa 2011 on these small, cramped maps without Ravagers, and I'm saying things like, yeah, the force field was too strong because the maps were cramped, there was no neutral depot to keep Protoss and Terran players honest. And that's the sort of thing that if an intellectually dishonest person were to hear, they would be upset. But the fact of the matter is that a TOS player now had to be so much better than a TOS player back in this day to win games. The onus is really on the Protoss players, way more than it was before. Zerg is way less restricted. The Queen is like 10 times better than it was before. I know I just talked about it, but not having to have an Evo to build a Spore is huge. There were so many moments back in this PvZ metagame where if you tried to be cute and delay Evo or skip Evo, look at this. IdrA delayed Evo because he wanted to go for some roach aggression, and look at this, he just lost his third. It's 11 minutes in the game and IdrA doesn't have a third. It looks as though Squirtle's breaking down his backdoor rocks. Now remember, whoever wins this game wins the series. This is a best of 5. Squirtle continuing to scout around with his real air units as opposed to hallucinated air units, although he's not even researched hallucinate yet. A Colossus is coming here, so is Thermal Lance. Honestly, I'm really just expecting Squirtle to make 2 or 3 Colossus, push out, and roll over IdrA. IdrA's third is so late. That little bit of roach aggression he did really put him behind. And it looks like Squirtle wants to take the third base right by IdrA's main. And a lot of times, whenever Zerg players would struggle and lose around the first 2 games of the year's life, you would often have people, especially people who didn't play Zerg, who would sit and say, well, why didn't the Zerg do X? Why wasn't the Zerg aggressive here? Why didn't he do this? Why didn't he do this? And we sort of seen this best of 5 was an interesting little example. IdrA tried to play macro style in all 4 opening games. In this game, he went for an aggressive opener and got completely punished. Now he's going to try to walk in and deny the third, and he's going to walk into Colossus Force Field. Let's see how this goes. Okay, he's going to lose most of his army here. Overlord's flying over, trying to sponge the damage, as IdrA's army is virtually just trapped, and there's really no way the Protoss can lose here. Let's just be honest, because there's nothing IdrA can do to combat this force field. All the TOS has to do is keep reinforcing and keep A moving up this ramp. He's right on top of the Zerg. The third base is right in the Zerg's face, and what do you know, when you can make a Zerg right on top of the Zerg, a third right on top of the Zerg, you win. So that's the game. Protoss player Squirtle takes it over IdrA. Sub for more IdrA games.